Let's imagine that you're sitting in a room with a single speaker. When the speaker produces a sound, it vibrates back and forth, creating waves of higher and lower air pressure in the room. The speaker isn't really pushing air towards your ears. The energy created by the movement of the speaker is traveling to your ears and changing the pressure of the air inside of them.
When we think about these waves, it can be helpful to imagine two people holding onto a rope. If one person shakes the rope, the energy will travel over to the other side, but the rope itself will not have traveled over to the other person. The thing about sound energy, though, is that it's traveling super fast.
So let's take a look at sound waves. What is the physical manifestation of sound waves? And what role does our perception play in making something a sound? The relationship between how things change over time and move through space can be kind of tricky to understand when we talk about sound. So I'm going to try and break it down by looking at little tiny snapshots of time. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that sound moves outward in all directions from its source. The only reason why a sound sounds quieter when you're behind a speaker rather than in front of it is that the speaker box is in between you and the source of the sound. Okay, so you're in the room with a speaker and we're going to play a sine tone at 250 Hz. Let's imagine the first 1 millisecond as the speaker starts to produce a sound. This is the amount of time it will take for the speaker to push all the way forward at 250 Hz. As it pushes outward, it forces the air particles directly in front of it into a smaller space. Another way to say this is that the air is being put under higher pressure because of the movement of the speaker. As the speaker continues to push outward, it creates progressively more air pressure. But the energy created by the movement of the speaker also travels outward from it at the same time. So let's divide this chunk into a bunch of even smaller chunks to get a clearer picture of what's happening. In the first chunk, the speaker pushes outward a little bit, creating a bit more air pressure. In the next chunk, the speaker pushes out a bit more, creating even more pressure in front of the speaker. And the slightly smaller amount of pressure that came from the first chunk is now a bit further outward in space. And this process will continue as the speaker continues to push outward. So if we zoom back to our 1 millisecond chunk, the speaker has finished its outward moving cycle and the sound energy has traveled outward about 0.33 meters. Because sound energy travels outward from the speaker at a constant rate, we can actually think of this cross-section of space as a histogram of the speaker movements over the course of the first millisecond. The sound energy out here came from the beginning of the speaker's outward moving cycle, and the sound energy close to the speaker was made much more recently. Another way to think about this is to say that the movement of the speaker and the changes in air pressure are two separate waves that are analogous to one another. That's to say that the movement of the speaker and the changes in air pressure follow each other exactly. Now let's look at the next 1 millisecond chunk. The speaker now moves backwards to its original position, and the energy that was created in the first 1 millisecond travels outward another 0.33 meters. But now it's in the space between the sound energy that moved outward and the speaker. When air pressure increases, there are more air particles packed into the same amount of space, which means that they had to come from somewhere to fill that space. So as the sound energy travels outward and the speaker moves backwards, effectively creating more space, the pressure in front of the speaker gets lower and lower. And that negative energy travels outward from the speaker in the same way that the positive energy did. And looking at the cross-section of air pressure at 2 milliseconds, we can see again how the air pressure has reduced as the speaker has moved backward. Okay, so the speaker hasn't even traveled outward a meter yet, but we have basically all we need to know at this point. Let's look at a couple key terms and relate them to this example so we can complete the picture. A wave cycle is when a wave goes from resting to maximum intensity, back to resting, then to minimum intensity, and then back to resting again. At this point in the example, the wave has completed half a wave cycle. So in order to complete the cycle, the speaker would continue to move backward past the point it started at, creating even lower air pressure. Then it would move forward again to its starting point, and the air pressure would increase along with it back to its original level. Frequency is the amount of cycles that a wave completes in a given amount of time. We could apply this equally to the movement of the speaker or the changes in air pressure. The wave in our example has a frequency of 250 Hz, which means that it completes 250 wave cycles in 1 second. Period is the amount of time that it takes for a wave to complete one cycle. So frequency and period are inversely proportional to one another. The period of our 250 Hz wave is 4 milliseconds. That's why it took 1 millisecond for the speaker to move all the way out, another 1 millisecond for it to move all the way back to the starting point, and it will take 2 more to move all the way back and all the way forward again. Wavelength is the spatial length of the wave. In order to calculate wavelength, we need to know the velocity of the sound wave. That's the speed it moves through any medium, and in air it's about 330 meters per second. We calculate wavelength by dividing the velocity of the wave by its frequency. So the wavelength of our 250 Hz wave is about 1.33 meters. The wave in our example traveled outward by 0.33 meters in the first quarter of its wave cycle, because 0.33 meters is 1/4 of its 1.33 meter wavelength. The last term we have to consider is amplitude. For a sound wave in air, amplitude is the measure of the intensity of the air pressure at any given moment. So if I turn up the level on the sine wave of the speaker will move further outward as it completes its wave cycles, and the changes in air pressure created by the movement of the speaker will also be greater. So when we talk about the amplitude of a sound, we're really talking about a sort of average of all the amplitudes. In order to be a wave, it has to change in amplitude, so the measure of pressure at any given moment doesn't really tell us very much. We use some maths to calculate that average, so I'll leave some links in the description if you're interested in those details. The scale that we use to compare the intensity of different sound waves is called decibels. If a sound wave increases by 6 dB, it has doubled in intensity. Humans can perceive an incredibly wide range of amplitudes. The sound of somebody breathing is about 10 dB, and the loudest sounds that we can hear without damaging our hearing is about 80 dB, which is over 11 times as intense. Unfortunately, a lot of everyday sounds are loud enough to cause hearing damage. The sound of an approaching subway averages out at about 100 dB, and the sound of a jet taking off is about 130 dB. So that's pretty much the basics of sound waves. But what if the speaker took 3 seconds to complete a cycle? Would it still be a sound wave? Well, there still would be changes in air pressure, but we wouldn't hear anything. 3 Hz is well out of the frequency range of human hearing, which is about 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. And this is where things start to get tricky when we talk about sound waves, because as a concept, they fundamentally rely on human perception. Let's go back and reconsider a few of the terms that I just used, starting with amplitude. Loudness and volume are terms that refer to perception. Although it's true that as the amplitude of a sound wave increases, we hear it as being louder, the wave itself is not getting louder. A wave of 3 Hz, well outside the range of human hearing, could increase in amplitude, but we would still not hear it. So it doesn't really make sense to say that the wave is getting louder. The term amplitude can refer to any wave, but loudness and volume refer specifically to how we experience sound waves. Frequency and pitch work in pretty much the same way. If we had a sound of a frequency of 440 Hz, we could equally say that it has a pitch of concert A. But if an object vibrated at 3 Hz, it wouldn't really make sense to say that it has a pitch of 3 Hz, because again, it's well outside the range of human hearing. To illustrate this point further, I'll play you a series of clicks. If I play you a series of clicks at 440 Hz, you'll hear a single sound. But if I slow that down to 3 Hz, you'll hear a rhythm. But it's the same clicks. So what we need to understand is that when things happen at a certain range of speeds, our brains will group them into a single event. But when they happen at a slower range of speeds, our brains will perceive them as separate events. It's just like with frame rate with images. If I move back and forth right now, you'll see me moving back and forth on your screen, but I'm not really moving on your screen. Your brain is just seeing me in one position and then another position really quickly afterwards, and it's like, oh, she was there, and now she's over to the left, so she must be moving. But if I slow the frame rate down, you'll see me as separate images. So if I play the clicks at one rate, they make a pitch, and if I play them at another, they make a rhythm. So even though we might think of pitch and rhythm as being in separate domains, they're not. They're just on either side of a division in our brain that separates continuous and discrete events. So it's kind of like there's this whole mess of activity going on beyond our perception, and our brains interpret a little slice of it. And obviously, we're able to make it through the world without getting hit by a car or eaten by a bear on most days. So clearly our perception is pretty effective. But I do think it's very easy to mistake what we perceive as being the same as what's going on in the world beyond our perception. So obviously the physics of sound waves are really important to understand. But as you can see, sound is a concept that is fundamentally reliant on human perception. So I think if we can separate what's going on out there in the big, big world and what's going on in our tiny little domes, So I think that if we can separate what's going on out there in the big, big world and what's going on in our tiny little domes, we'll have a much more solid foundation to work from. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode of Sounds Good. This was a really fun one, sound waves. I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's joined my Patreon recently. It means so much to me to know that there's people out there who want to support my work like that. And if you'd like to join those people, you can check me out at patreon.com/soundsgoodchannel, and you can get access to these videos earlier than everyone else behind the scenes. And oh my god, there's a cat. This cat does not get early access to my videos. Where'd he go? Hey. Hey. Yeah, the cat doesn't get early access to my videos, and because it's not a part of my Patreon, so yeah. Don't be like the cat and sign up to my Patreon.